Welcome to Daily Chumash Summaries. I wrote these summaries in memory of my beloved paternal grandfather, Ousher Zelig ben Myer HaLevi Z, and recently I decided to put these into an audio format as well. If you'd like to be added to the email list so that you can receive these summaries in written format, please send me an email to itistaught@gmail.com, or else you can follow the link in the show notes of this episode to be added directly. There's also an opportunity to sponsor an episode of this podcast, which you can do by visiting itistaught.com and then clicking on the link that says support this project. So if you have a loved one's yahrzeit coming up or a birthday or for whatever other reason, if you'd like to support me in the work that I do so I can continue doing this kind of work, please consider sponsoring an episode. And finally, if you enjoy this podcast, please consider checking out my other podcast, the It Is Taught podcast, where I focus on the daily Tanya portions in a way that is meant to be down to earth and relatable and accessible to all. And with all of that being said, let's get into today's Chumash portion. Parshas Tisa, 4th Aliya. In today's Aliya, we're going to talk about how Hashem speaks to Moshe regarding his glory. So Hashem tells Moshe that Moshe found favor in God's eyes. So just as Moshe requested in yesterday's Aliya, Hashem will remove his divine presence from resting on the other nations of the world. As a side note, Bilam and Job, both of who were non-Jewish prophets, did not experience God directly, but rather via a messenger. So now back to our Aliya. So Moshe, feeling it to be an auspicious time, then asks God to show him his glory. Hashem replies that in due time he will show Moshe his glory in order to teach Moshe how to pray for God's mercy, if indeed the merit of the patriarchs become exhausted, as Moshe thought they might someday. This is alluding to the prayer where we invoke Hashem's 13 attributes of mercy. Hashem promises Moshe that this prayer of the 13 attributes will always have an effect, and Hashem will show favor and mercy as a result at the time that he decides. Hashem specifies, however, that he will not show Moshe his face, as Moshe would not be able to handle that and stay alive. He says that there is a place on the mountain where he will hide Moshe, so Moshe will be able to handle it when Hashem does speak to him. This verse also alludes to the idea that God is not limited by space and is found everywhere, and rather all space is to be found within God. During this whole series of events, Moshe had reached the height of human perfection. This made him extra vulnerable to injurious forces. Hashem tells Moshe that he will protect Moshe from these forces with his word. Hashem continues and says that he will then remove the guidance of his glory, and instead Moshe will see his back. To illustrate this, God shows Moshe the knot of the tefillin worn on the head, which are tied at the back. This was to demonstrate the interconnection between the spiritual and physical worlds. And that is the end of our Aliya for today. Thanks for listening to my Chumash Summaries podcast. If you liked this podcast, please consider subscribing on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And please consider also checking out my daily Tanya podcast, the It Is Taught podcast. It's also found on Apple, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any questions or any feedback or comments or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me at itistaught@gmail.com.